Today, we are digging into a piece of Canadian history that for decades was quite literally buried and almost completely forgotten. It's a story about control, segregation, and incredible resilience. And it all starts with a simple piece of paper. Just think about that for a second. For over half a century, for thousands and thousands of people right here in Canada, the basic human right to just move around freely hinged on getting a permission slip. And this wasn't some kind of suggestion. It was a cold, hard reality enforced by the police.
So what exactly was this policy? Well, it was called the pass system. And it was basically a tool of segregation that operated right out in the open, but is somehow then almost totally scrubbed from our national memory.
Okay, so from 1885 all the way into the 1940s, this system was in full effect. If you were a First Nations person living on a reserve, your freedom of movement was completely at the mercy of a government official. You were, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner in your own home.
And this control, it seeped into every single part of life. We're talking about the most basic things, wanting to visit your cousin on the next reserve over, needing to go to the market to sell your crops, or even trying to check on your own child at a residential school. Every single one of those things required a pass. And if you got caught without one, you could be arrested, thrown in jail, or just marched back to your reserve by force.
So, how on earth did a system like this come to be? Well, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. To really get it, we've got to look back at the decade leading up to 1885, a time of huge conflict and change on the prairies.
You see, in the 1870s, the treaties are signed and the reserve system is created. Then, the bison, which were the lifeblood of the plains, are nearly wiped out, leading to mass starvation. That desperation explodes in 1885 with the Northwest Resistance. After that resistance was crushed, the federal government went into overdrive to lock down control, clearing the way for settlers and the new railway. The pass system was one of its most powerful tools.
And the government wasn't exactly subtle about its reasons. This quote from Hayter Reed, a top official at the time, lays it out in black and white. The whole point was control and segregation, all framed as preventing complications with the new settlers. It was designed, pure and simple, to keep people apart. But here is where it gets really mind-boggling. This entire system, this thing that controlled thousands of lives for 60 years, it had no legal basis. None. It was never passed into law. It was just a policy, enforced by sheer will. And this wasn't some kind of secret. This memo shows that even the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald himself, knew the policy was illegal. He knew it violated treaty rights, but they pushed ahead anyway, basically saying it would be a mistake to get too caught up in, the actual law.
So if it wasn't even a real law, how did it actually work day to day? Well, it all boiled down to the nearly absolute power of one single person on each reserve.
That person was the Indian agent, and this guy was the ultimate gatekeeper. He could say yes or no to a pass for any reason he wanted or for no reason at all. But his power went so much further. He was also the local judge. He controlled your ability to make a living. He could get your elected leaders fired, and he was the one who enforced sending children to residential schools. He held the keys to almost every part of your life.
Just try to imagine what that was like. You might have to walk for days just to get to the agent's office, and who knows if he'll even be there. If you're lucky, you get to see him, and then you have to plead your case. And he alone decides. If he says no, that's it. Game over. There was no one to appeal to. It was a system built on total arbitrary power.
And the human cost of that control was just immense. Leona Blondeau, who grew up under the system, remembered that anger. For her, it wasn't about some grand political idea. It was about the simple, painful childhood memory of only getting to go into town once the entire summer because her mother wasn't free.
So what happens when you confine whole communities for over 60 years? The impact was catastrophic. It created these ripple effects that are absolutely still being felt today.
Economically, it was a disaster. If you can't leave to sell your goods or find work, your community is destined for poverty. Socially, it created this profound isolation, cutting families off from each other and preventing huge cultural gatherings like the Sundance. And that was the point. It was a weapon used for cultural suppression, all part of this bigger government policy of aggressive assimilation.
Now, for the Métis people, the aftermath of 1885 was a whole different kind of devastation. They were branded as rebels, which forced many to hide who they were just to survive. At the exact same time, a totally corrupt land system stripped most of them of their land, creating generations of what became known as the Road Allowance people, families living as squatters on the side of the road.
Which brings us to a really important question. If this system was so huge and lasted for so long, why haven't most of us ever heard of it? Well, the answer is just as shocking as the policy itself.
Because the evidence was destroyed on purpose. In 1941, as the system was finally ending, the government sent out an order. Collect all the passbooks, the physical proof that this system existed, and send them to Ottawa to be burned.
And that cover-up was incredibly effective. So effective that by the 1970s, the Canadian government itself wasn't sure if the pass system had actually been real. The policy just vanished from the history books. The only place the truth was kept alive was in the stories passed down by the elders who had lived through it.
Now you might think, wow, what a dark and bizarre chapter in Canadian history. But you might also think it was just that, a Canadian thing. But its influence, it went global.
Get this, in 1902, officials from South Africa came to Canada, and they studied our reserve and pass system specifically as a model for social control. It became one of the blueprints they used to build their own infamous system of racial segregation, Apartheid.
Unearthing this history isn't just an academic exercise. It's actually fundamental if we want to understand the present and that long, really difficult road we call reconciliation.
And that brings us right up to today. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report, which included this many, 94 calls to action. These are the steps it laid out as being necessary to start healing from the legacy of policies just like the past system.
But as this story shows, we're still just scratching the surface of the full truth. And it leaves us with a pretty profound question, right? If a huge piece of our own history can be so completely hidden, what does it really take to find reconciliation? It's a challenge for all of us to keep digging, to keep listening, and to keep learning.